All right, thank you so much again for welcoming me to my second time in Italy, my favorite time. We're going to go on a little journey. First, I'm going to take you on a small history lesson of bug bounties because it sets the context for where we are today and at this age of AI. As AI is taking over and infiltrating everything in our lives, we're going to see what problems might arise, how we might be able to harness it better, and how we can use it for the future. So, way back in the days of old frack. So I'm so happy to see frack is back. Frack is back, you guys. Frack is back. So, that's right. But back in the day, there were hardly any tools, hardly any resources. And for us to learn how to hack, we had to figure it out ourselves, write our own scripts. How many of you use burp? There was no burp. How many of you use fuzzers? There were no fuzzers. You had to write your own, you had to figure it out yourself, you had to learn from your peers, and you had to learn from whatever you could download down a very, very narrow pipeline to the internet, text files. And in fact, the first bug bounty that happened in 1995, Netscape started it, it was only $500, and for a very long time, that was the only bug bounty pretty much in the world. Did that make any hackers rich? Not really. Did that encourage them to report bugs to Netscape? Maybe. But nothing new happened under the bug bounty sun until the birth of modern bug bounties. So back in 2010, how many of you remember when Google started offering $1,337 for a bug in Chrome? Chrome was only 2 years old at that time, and it was the only product in scope. So a lot of people think that, Google started this bug bounty craze and it had, such a large scope and it was paying out all this money. In fact, it was barely paying a little over double of what the going price had been since 1995. And I remember a lot of people were telling me, because I worked at Microsoft at the time, when is Microsoft going to start paying for bugs? Well, at the time, Microsoft had one of the biggest pipelines of vulnerability data coming in for free from the hackers, and it was over 500,000 non-spam email messages a year coming into Microsoft, expecting Microsoft to do something about it, to triage it, to figure out whether or not it's a real vulnerability and how long it was going to take them to fix it, how many other products might have it. Over 800 supported products that Microsoft had, it had to contend with. So I knew at the time that if Microsoft started paying bug bounties even on one product, it would go broke. So the first thing that I did at Microsoft was I eased them into it. I got them paying $250,000 for something called the Blue Hat Prize, which was a defensive competition. We had a lot of academics participating in that prize. And it warmed them up to the idea of paying security researchers. Pretty much, I had come from the hacker community. I wanted to keep my friends out of jail and get them paid some money. So we had the Blue Hat Prize, we launched it in 2011, we paid it out in 2012, and by then, there was a trend starting. And I had convinced the executives at Microsoft that, one, they didn't like it that vulnerabilities were getting reported to third-party entities that were paying for bugs. How many of you have heard of ZDI? Right? iDefense, also, back in the day. So they were collecting vulnerability information, then giving it to Microsoft for free to fix it, but they knew about the vulnerability and they were imposing a deadline. So Microsoft didn't really like that. However, it wasn't until I could show a trend of data where there were more vulnerabilities in flagship products like Internet Explorer that started coming in through third-party brokers like that, even defensive brokers. And they finally agreed that, you know what, maybe it's time to pay for vulnerabilities. I remember walking into a meeting trying to convince the heads of dev, test, and PM of IE to pay for bugs. I had calculated all of the critical and high severity bugs and how much it would cost Microsoft to pay $5,000, which at the time would have been a lot more than what Google was paying. It was less than $2 million would have paid for all the bugs that were coming in for free. But I showed them something that was really important. I showed them that the hackers who were willing to report to Microsoft for free were getting something in exchange. It wasn't money. It was recognition. It was their name in a Microsoft bulletin. And the problem with that form of reward is that if it was in a beta product, there was no bulletin. So they wouldn't tell Microsoft about bugs in beta products, they would wait. They would wait until it was out of beta, and that was kind of the worst time ever to learn about a vulnerability. You just got out of beta, and then suddenly this big spike of vulnerability reports come in. They were free, but they were gonna cost the reputation of the company. So I told them that if they put a bug bounty at the beginning of the IE beta period, that we could harness the power of those researchers, get them to come in earlier, and essentially reshape the traffic of vulnerability reports. And they agreed. And they also agreed, to my surprise, that they would pay, at the time, the highest year-round defensive bug bounty, which was $100,000. How many of you think that's too cheap? Well, in 2013, it wasn't. It was the highest amount being paid. And they were willing to do that not for any kind of exploit, but a brand new exploitation technique. Because at the time, they would only learn about brand new exploitation techniques about once every 3 years or so, once every 3 years when a new operating system would come out. And they'd learn about them the hard way through actual in-the-wild exploitation. So this was an opportunity. And remember, I had to warm them up with a $250,000 defensive prize. $100,000 didn't sound so bad. I think they spent more than that on the party at DEF CON. So we were able to launch the biggest bounty in the world at the time. We were able to launch the first bounty against a beta product, which reshaped the traffic for the bounties coming in. And then finally, what happened then was the Pentagon asked me to come and explain to them how the biggest software company in the world was suddenly paying bug bounties, and maybe how could they do it too. So I walked into the Pentagon like this, and after about 3 years, they were ready to start their first bug bounty program. And that's when we launched Hack the Pentagon. At that point, I know that it seems like today, 9 years later, that bug bounties are very common. They're not as common as you think they are. At this point, we've got vulnerability disclosure programs written into most laws, about procurement for governments, certainly written into the Cyber Resilience Act here in Europe, that you should have a vulnerability disclosure program. And those are becoming more common. But bug bounties are still not as common as you would think. And the reason for that is because most organizations can't handle the bugs they already know about. So here we are at this point in time. Now, how many of you saw that Apple raised the price of their bug bounty? $2 million up to $5 million, right? Does that seem too low? How many of you think it's too low? Well, I think it's too high, and I'll tell you why. There are perverse incentives that are created when you are a company that needs to try and secure your operating system, your software, before anybody can attack it. At a certain point, the bad guys don't care. They can keep jacking the prices up as high as they want. But you, on the defensive side, have to maintain some sort of pipeline, and you have to maintain the ability to pay your people fairly whose job it is to prevent those bugs in the first place. Otherwise, you're creating perverse incentives. So they're kind of knocking right up against the door of perverse incentives at this point. I tried to tell them that when they first launched their bug bounty program. They lost some engineers that very week that they announced it. Why? Because those engineers were not making, I think it was $200,000 at the time, were not making $200,000 per what they did for their day job every day. So the problem with these incentives is that there is a logical limit, a logical ceiling. Crypto bounties, on the other hand, are on the rise, so if you're into making a lot of money on bug bounties, I would look there. So where are we now? What does the bounty ecosystem look like? It's still a lot of average bugs, a lot of low-hanging fruit, a lot of average bounties, and by average, I mean not paying out very much for most of these bugs. Most hackers cannot earn a living wage through bug bounty programs. There are some outliers for sure, some really good hackers who have managed to automate and get very, very efficient at finding vulnerabilities. But even the very first hacker to earn $1 million total, it took him 3 years, but even the first hacker to earn $1 million said he never looked for critical bugs. They took too long. He would automate, and he would write scripts, and he would try and prioritize his targeting for medium severity bugs because they paid okay and they were easier to find. So the myth, I used to work in Linux, I used to work in open source software, I was a Linux developer back at the turn of the millennium. And the myth of many eyes making all bugs shallow hasn't been proven out, especially even with bug bounties. So how is it that AI is going to help us, or like I said in the title, is going to hurt us? Well, first, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the fact that, yes, there's a new OWASP top 10 for AI vulnerabilities. It looks a whole lot like the categories of bugs, just applied with an AI veneer. So yes, you've got prompt injection. Is that a new category of bug? Well, the things that you can achieve through prompt injection are very similar to sparkling classic injection flaws, right? They are very, very similar. Information disclosure, elevation of privilege, improperly secured resources on the back end, they look a lot the same. So to me, yes, it's a new attack vector, it's a new technology, but it's kind of the same as every other technology that's come before. I'm not going to focus so much on bug bounty hunting in the AI space itself. I am going to talk more about how AI is being used and the new developments that have happened just in the past few months in AI as it applies to bug bounties. So one day this summer, how many of you have heard of Crossbow? I call it Crossbow. I think they knew that they were automating a cross-site scripting discovery engine. They found some other kinds of bugs, and we'll go over one of those in just a minute. But Crossbow was a really interesting case because it was the first time not only did a fully autonomous AI system beat all of the humans on the HackerOne leaderboard to become #1, first #1 in the US, and then they also became #1 globally. But it was, in fact, something that they had not particularly intended to do. They were testing it in a real-world environment. But the way that they describe it, and you should go over and read their blog about the day that they became #1, they woke up in the morning and found, to their surprise, that they had surpassed all the humans. And they had only been doing it for about 9 months, so less than a year. And I don't have any association with Crossbow. I do know those guys from back in the day, and I do know they're some of the most intelligent and efficient security researchers from the old school. So it makes sense that they would have been able to create the first AI to autonomously do this. So that means no human in the loop except at the very end. And the reason they had to do human in the loop at the very end was because it would have broken a lot of the platform's rules about, no automated scripting only, right? You had to have a human validate at the very end. But all of the bug discovery, and in this case, the schooled case, all of this experimentation was done autonomously by this AI system. So what did it do? It basically went in, it tried a bunch of different things, much like a human hacker would. It tried to enumerate, it unpacked a jar file, it thought maybe it had remote code execution there. It couldn't execute remote code. However, it found this configuration engine, and it used its include feature to bypass authentication and then pull an arbitrary file off the server. So essentially, it was able to do all of this reasoning on its own. They've got a great blog post, I pointed to it here, where you can read through step by step exactly what this AI did. And what was interesting was it learned much like a human hacker would learn. Seeing that there were different error codes coming back as it tried certain things, then it realized that once it got a 200 coming back from the server, that it had found something potentially exploitable and kept going. But even before this, it had been used to automate and narrow down the target space, to go for programs that might pay out the most for certain categories of bugs that it was good at finding. And it did a lot of the same things that the humans who had reached the top of the leaderboards had learned how to do, just a hell of a lot faster. And it's not going to slow down. It's not going to stop. This was an inflection point. It happened in June. They are continuing to innovate this platform, and it can run by itself. So what is it good at? Well, since it was trained on a lot of the data that was already in the bug bounty platforms, that means that it was actually trained on a lot of the lower hanging fruit. there are fewer and fewer hackers who are capable of finding the most serious vulnerabilities. But what this thing trained on was a lot of cross-site scripting bugs. I think the HackerOne report this year said that for the first time in 5 years, the number of cross-site scripting bugs is finally starting to decline. And that's probably due to framework hardening, right? Where they're automating a lot of the input validation in different frameworks, right? So the technology that is being used to build web apps, which is still the most popular target on these platforms, is improving and therefore shifting the types of bugs that are being found and reported. But other than that, it did all of this mass scanning, endpoint discovery, validation of its exploit development, and essentially just did it at a super fast pace and at scale. So what about the fact that, remember I said that most bug bounty hunters, human bug bounty hunters, can't actually make a living. Most AI doesn't do what Crossbow does. Most of the researchers who are using AI right now, when they were surveyed, they said they use it to write reports. A lot of those reports are hallucinations. They are slop. They are not actually validated. They sound pretty good though, right? And so a lot of how AI is being used in bug bounty right now is actually poisoning the pipeline and making it more difficult for organizations that are running bug bounty programs to actually run them successfully. So what do we have here? We've got human triage that is burning out at the onset of this AI slop that's being generated and flooding out their systems. Remember I mentioned that Microsoft had over 500,000 non-spam email messages a year coming in to the email address secure at Microsoft. That took a team of dozens and dozens of people doing triage, doing case management, and forget about all of the developers that had to be involved in making sure that those bugs were understood and addressed comprehensively. Most organizations don't even have that basic layer. And what the bug bounty platforms provide, it's triage, but it's not usually context-aware triage. It's not usually triage that can tell you anything besides, does it repro or not? Sometimes it doesn't even validate the impact of the bug if it does repro, right? So there's a whole lot missing in a lot of these organizations, and them getting overwhelmed with additional AI slop is actually upsetting the balance in bug bounty programs such as they are. Now, how many of you know how many bug bounty programs there are roughly in the world? How many of you think there are, I don't know, 10,000 bug bounty programs running in the world? Okay, you think there's more or less? More or less? Less, okay. All right, maybe 5,000 bug bounty programs running in the world? Less, yeah, okay, this guy knows. So even on the biggest platform in the world, there are fewer than 2,000 customers. So let alone bug bounty programs. So you can imagine that this onset of AI slop is targeting some of the very few bug bounty programs that there are in the world, which is a much smaller number than all those press releases would lead you to believe. So we're upsetting the natural order of things. We're upsetting the natural evolution and maturity of the internet right now. So you think maybe you just use AI to do some of that work, right? I mentioned that it's hard work trying to figure out what is real, what is context-aware triage. So maybe just use some AI. However, the AI is being trained on what the human triagers have done. And I can tell you from experience, when we see a wide variety of human triage that just misses the mark. We've seen bugs marked as out of scope that were definitely in scope. We've seen things where they couldn't repro and they closed it. We've seen things that were serious security issues, but definitely not, a vulnerability per se, maybe a design issue, and they were closed, right? So AI triage is being trained on the imperfect triage and a very small data set, a very small sample set of data on human triage. There's a lot of overconfidence in AI, and actually, even the users who are using current AI technology to help them triage say that it maybe saves them 3 or 4 hours a week of work, because they do still have to check and validate. So what are we going to do about this? There's another problem here. And I mentioned how we used to have to learn how to hack, right? We learned at the feet of our ancestors in hacking, right? What happens when you start essentially tooling and skilling? And there's a reason I used kitties in here, right? Remember the term script kiddie? There are AI script kiddies at this point. There are vibe kitties that are figuring out, like, you know, I don't know how to code, I don't know how to write an exploit, I don't know how to do any of these things. I'm just going to tell AI to do it, and sometimes they might get lucky, right? Sometimes they might tell AI to go and learn from someone who does know how to hack, and then apply what the AI learned to then go out and enumerate targets. So what happened in the early 2000s, when I was a professional pen tester at the very beginning of professional pen testing, was you had that group of skilled people who knew how to hack, and then you started seeing more and more tooling come in that made it easier for less skilled people. They weren't unskilled completely, but they were less skilled, and had them coming in and doing it for a fraction of the price. So what we saw was a push down in the market for when we used to be able to charge, you know, lots and lots of money, to everything was commoditized, and we had to compete with big consulting firms who had people who were just running tools. And everybody just wanted to check the box, say they had a pen test. They didn't care if it was us or this kid running a tool. Similarly, at this point, AI is starting to repeat this cycle, where it's overpromising what it can find and the validity and the seriousness of what it can find. And it's starting to have organizations cut down on their security staff, cut down on the skill level of their security staff. And unfortunately, there's going to be a tipping point at some point where we have taken out most entry-level jobs and replaced them with AI. And without that pipeline of workers, what we are going to end up with is a thinning out of the middle tier of skilled researchers, and then eventually the upper tier of skilled researchers. This is a wise old grandma hacker teaching the young children, you know, how to hack. But we're going to run out of people who know how these systems work eventually, if this keeps going. You need the entry level to train into the mid-level, to train into the expert level. So, starving the talent pipeline. The real problem here is that AI is not good at finding business logic flaws. It might get better, but humans are not as good as finding those as they are at finding the low-hanging fruit. So it's going to take a while for AI to train up on what little human bodies of knowledge there are out there about how to discover and really exploit business logic flaws. So at a certain point, again, we're going to lose the muscle as a community if we don't take care of this. So right now, this is the hope, right? That humans are really good, humans plus AI, everybody's saying human in the loop, that's the way to go, and AI is pretty derpy. But if we lose this pipeline, guess where we're going to be? This is where we're going to end up, right? The threat is real. So AI can help us, but only if we are intentional about how we guide it, how we use it. There are programs out there, there are startups out there, Crossbow is one of them, there are a few others, but, and some of them are really improving the efficiency, giving us that AI plus human in the loop, wonderful feeling. They might start getting better at triage, it's possible, but only if humans also get better at triage. And from what I've seen in the past decade or so of helping organizations run bug bounty programs and working alongside some of the triagers from some of the major platforms, the triagers aren't getting that much better. So the real benefit here would be, of course, when you're trying to prevent bugs in the first place, use AI as early in the security development lifecycle as possible. Everybody knows that's the way to prevent most bugs. Using it at least in the CI/CD pipeline to catch vulnerabilities, at least before they're released, even if you missed a few steps and missed a few bugs along the way, that's still better than nothing, right? And here's where it comes to something else. Something you probably weren't expecting me to say today. And that's about universal basic income. You may have heard some of the big AI CEOs have talked about it. I think Altman even sponsored a UBI experiment. And why are they doing this? Because they know what they're doing to the labor market. They know what they're doing to the labor market, and it is something that they are going to have to come to terms with. Now, where would the money come from? The AI profits. If you think about it, the AI trained on what all of you created. So why shouldn't you get a dividend from your creation? This is a way for us to move forward, not just whether or not AI takes all of our jobs, but kind of hoping AI takes all of our jobs, and we get a dividend from that. We get a benefit as a society. So what I would say to you is that whether you're a bug bounty hunter or any job in cybersecurity, you must be feeling the heat right now. How many of you are feeling a little heat right now? That you're using AI in your jobs, right? You're trying to use more AI. Your companies that you work at are trying to incorporate AI into everything, like Salt Bae, sprinkle a little AI on everything. But we're not yet rewarding some of the deeper flaws that only humans at this point can still find. So push for things like human-based mentorship alongside AI-assisted learning, communities like this one, and definitely push for things like UBI. I want to take an example from the other gig work that preceded the gig work in vulnerability disclosure by just a couple years. Do you know the same investors who invested in Uber and Lyft started their investments in BugCrowd and HackerOne? It's the same marketplace idea. And this is a Venmo, or sorry, not a Venmo, a Waymo. This is a Waymo. I wrote in it. It was weird. But the fact of the matter is that it was originally touted as freedom for the worker, as flexibility, as opportunity. All of the same language was used to sell this to the workers who would have to seed the marketplace in the first place. We're all workers. I mean, I think we're all workers. None of us are independently wealthy at this point, right? But what happened in the gig economy for drivers can absolutely happen in the gig economy for hackers. And this is something that we need to pay attention to, because the end game for AI is replacing workers at some level. Yes, making workers more efficient, but ultimately reducing the need for human workers. And in fact, bug bounties are kind of the worst gig job ever, because at least if you drive an Uber, drive someone to the airport, you're going to get paid something, even if your wages have been brought down. Bug bounty hunters only get paid if they're the first one to get there, first one to find the bug. And they often do all the same work and get paid nothing. So it's a warning from the fact that we are seeing this unfold in other industries in front of our very eyes. All right, we're all training our replacements right now. We should be expecting this, but we don't need to fear it. We need to fear profiteering that results from this. So there will be an AI bubble burst. There's always a bubble burst. It's a huge bubble, at least in the United States. I think 60% of the venture capital last year went to AI companies. 60%. But we're hackers. And if there's anyone who can change the world, it's you guys. So advocate for UBI as a fair knowledge dividend. I saw this right outside the hotel, here in Bergamo. You know, ultimately it would be great if we didn't have to work, if we could just create, if we could just invent, if we could just be. I don't think we're going to quite get there with UBI in our generation, in our lifetime, but we might be able to put a safety net around us to preserve our creativity. So this cat that you've been seeing throughout the slides was definitely inspired by the cat that I have right now. Some of you who know me knew I used to have a cat named Scappy because he was dumb and fuzzy for 17 years. But when Scappy passed on, we got 2 kittens, and one of them sits like this in real life. He has taught me that it's okay to be a little bit lazy. It's okay to just live your life. And, you know, in fact, we all should be trying to work less and dream more. Thank you.